Thank you for joining us. Please feel free to share in the chat maybe where you're tuning in from today and what you hope to learn. We're very, very excited for this conversation today. My name is Lisa Meekum, and I'm a volunteer here with Families for Depression Awareness, and we're welcoming you to our conversation, providing mental health support through collaborative conversations. I'm a person with lived experience of depression, and I've been a caregiver for others experiencing depression and bipolar disorder. We're so glad to have you here with us, those of you joining live and those watching the replay of this video later. When we talk about traditional mental health resources, we may be talking about different therapeutic modalities, psychiatric care, inpatient and outpatient care. But it's our hope that from this talk and the others that we have, you may come away with more unconventional resources for your toolkit for mental wellness. Going to tell you a little bit about how our program's going to go tonight. After a little bit more of my introduction, I'm going to welcome Dr. Buke Kalawale to help us understand how we can use motivational interviewing, a collaborative, goal-oriented counseling approach as we support our loved ones. Many caregivers find ourselves in a challenging position when it comes to supporting people who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. On the one hand, encouraging people to talk about it, to acknowledge it, to seek care, can have the potential to backfire and damage our relationship, while not raising the issue can give our loved one's mood disorder the opportunity to worsen. So we hope, again, that this conversation will help us deal with that gray area in between. We encourage you to share your questions or comments in the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll weave them in when we can. This program is being recorded and will be available to watch immediately after it airs. And we'd like to remind you that we're doing a survey to evaluate our program. And if you can stick around after the presentation, you'll have a chance to fill it out, which helps us improve our programs in the future. I'd love to tell you a little bit about Families for Depression Awareness. Our mission is to help families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder, to get people well, and to prevent suicides. Our philosophy is that when a person is living with depression or bipolar disorder, it's the people around them. It's the parents, the siblings, the grandparents, the friends, all of those people in their lives that have a strong and powerful position to support that loved one that really help. Yet caregivers don't always know what to do, and that's where Families for Depression Awareness comes in. We provide education, training, support, specifically geared towards family caregivers so that you can be a strong advocate for your loved ones, a partner in care, and most importantly, so that we can support family units, because that's what we really believe helps to improve health outcomes. The hub of our resources is our website up there on the slide, familyaware.org, which some of you may have already visited, but if you have not yet had the chance, please go to our website and you'll see other webinars and workshops that we've had in the past, new ones that are coming up in the future. We've got web tools such as our depression and bipolar screening test and our caregiver stress test. We also have a mental health family tree tool on our website, and you can find loads of other resources, including family stories and expert interviews. So we encourage you to visit familyaware.org for more information and resources, and the QR code there on the screen will get you signed up for our newsletter. Before we launch in, I would love to thank our supporters this evening, Takeda, AbbVie, Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program, and our corporate members, Sage and Biogen, and Lundbeck. And then, of course, people just like you. People like you who donate to us, who believe in our mission, believe in our cause. And if you're one of those people who've given us a financial contribution so that we can provide programming for free on issues of depression and bipolar disorder and how they affect families, we thank you. We truly, truly appreciate you. It's my great pleasure to introduce our expert for our discussion this evening, Dr. Buke Kalawale. Dr. Buke Kalawale is a Black, queer, gender nonconforming psychologist, executive coach, and facilitator in pursuit of equity with love, boldness, empathy, and vulnerability. Her purpose is to boldly disrupt systems of oppression with love so that we can all show up in the fullness of our humanity with authenticity and vulnerability. She is the founder and executive director of Relationship HQ, a place that exists to nurture vibrant human connection so that anyone served feels whole, seen, and celebrated in the mirror and in the world. Relationship HQ proudly centers the healing and growth of people of color and queer folks through a menu of offerings, including psychotherapy, coaching, workshops, and organizational wellness and transformation programs. So welcome, Dr. Buki. I'm so glad to have you here. And as I said to you right before we started, I've been thinking very much about what you're going to help us with tonight. I've had many opportunities just in this last week alone where I think having the ability to listen better and respond better would be helpful. So let's go ahead and get started. If you'd like to just give us a sense of what motivational interviewing is all about.
Sorry, I totally forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much for your introduction. And I'm so excited to be in this conversation with you and to tell you about MI. MI is short for motivational interviewing, and you hear me use that acronym throughout. And the first thing I'll say before I tell you a little bit about MI is that this model is such a powerful model that I think it changed how I certainly practice as a professional, but I think it also changed who I am as a human being in relationships with like people. So the way that I'm a wife, the way that I'm a friend, the way that I'm a parent is all informed by MI. And so whenever I have the opportunity to teach people about this model, to introduce people to this, it is like to use the word excitement feels like an understatement. So technically speaking, right, the technical definition of MI is that it's a way of having conversations with people about change, so that essentially you are strengthening the person's own motivation and commitment to change through the conversation. So essentially, it's really about learning to listen deeply to people so that you can help them resolve the ambivalence, or at least reduce the ambivalence they may be having about making change, so that their feet can move in line with the change that they desire. My favorite definition, though, of MI is that it's love with a goal. And what that means is like having a guided conversation with someone that really focuses on helping a person find their own motivation, figure out for themselves, what does this change mean for me, and why do I want this change? But the context and the environment in which they have that conversation is one where there is compassion, where they feel accepted, where they feel cared for, right? And so that's what MI, it really, really is. It's a way of us having conversations with people, but really rather than, a lot of times when we're in conversations, we're really used to, a lot of times really telling people what we think that they should do. Right? MI really essentially offers a framework and offers skills that helps us put ourselves in a much more productive stance in those conversations, and helps us really listen deeply to people and help them really hear themselves in terms of the arguments for change that they are making, right? And really, but the environment that we create for that conversation is the piece that feels critical. And then what we pay attention to in the conversation is also what's critical. So let me stop there. I feel like that's a lot. How much sense does that make, if any?
No, it's great. And I think when you and I first met and talked about this, this is obviously a technique you use as a professional, but it sounds like you're using it throughout your life. And tonight we're talking about using it as a caregiver in those moments where you're trying to have a conversation with someone and you're not trying to fix them, you're not trying to change them, you're just trying to listen better. So how is this different than usually how one might go about having these types of conversations?
Yeah, a lot of times when we're in these conversations, right, when we are trying to support, I really love the thing you said earlier, Lisa, when I was listening to your introduction, right? It's that people find themselves in one of two ways: that you are pushing the conversation and engaging in the conversation, of it a lot of times driven from a place of like care, maybe even desperation, right? But the moves we make in the conversation oftentimes or sometimes inadvertently affects or ruptures the relationship, right, with our loved one. Or you sort of have a hands-off approach where you avoid, right? Part of what's beautiful about MI is that it's a method that gives you a way of being in the conversation, right, in a way that holds the relationship, right, and also helps the person be able to really sort of start to figure out what they want. So rather than, part of what I think is beautiful about MI is that it eliminates this thing that the ways that we some move as human beings, where we're really used to telling people what we think that they should do. Like we see a problem, right? We see the ways in which our family members mood disorder is affecting their lives, right? Sometimes also affecting our own lives, right? And the stance we have is, right, entering the conversation, giving unsolicited information, unsolicited advice, and just moving in a way that sort of is activating and starts to create reactivity. So MI essentially, what's beautiful about it is that it gives you as a helper, you as a loved one, how to position yourself in that conversation to do what's most useful in conversations about change, and even more to really empower your loved one to be thinking about the issue for themselves, being the owner, and like sort of almost like being the owner of the change, and start to figure out for themselves what they want to do about it. So it really moves us out of this position that we somehow unintentionally take of almost being the expert or being the person who knows best, that ends up leaving our loved ones feeling judged, misunderstood, criticized. All of the things that we didn't intend to happen usually happen in the conversations because we're trying to push for change rather than supporting people to explore the possibilities of change and what that looks like for them.
Yeah, I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the times, I've been in this position of wanting to help somebody, and the writer Anne Lamott, I think, said help is the sunny side of control.
Mm.
That's like we've got this motivation of wanting to help, but really it's about controlling, because when people are hurting, it affects us, and we want that to end, of course, right? We don't want people to suffer. So this old way of doing things, which I've definitely done many, many times, this sort of jumping to help, jumping to give advice, is almost like this closing down. And the way you're talking about is almost like creating space and having the tools to open it up so that there's space, there's room. We're not lecturing, we're not, giving people a list of things to do. That's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
1,000%. Everything you're saying, Lisa, is 100% spot on. The piece I would add, it's almost like part of what I think is beautiful about this model, and is it's like it teaches you how to create what I call an environment of value. That when you're in conversation, how do I engage this conversation? With this assumption that like this is not a one-time conversation, right? But how do I hold space in this conversation where my loved one is going to want to return to wanting to continue the conversation? Like the conversation feels so useful for them, feels so helpful, feels so nourishing for them that they want to actually come back to the conversation with you. Right. So MI essentially gives you a set of tools to know how to stand that in that. And, Lisa, part of the thing that, we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that often happens is this thing we call the fixing reflex, right? That like when we are in these conversations about change, or we actually are just seeing the difficulties and the problems it's causing, it's activating for us as people who love, right, our family members, and we want them to be well, right? And so oftentimes how we then move because of that thing that's online that we're not paying attention to, we're not regulating, we're not slowing down, we let that show up and drive the conversation, and ends up actually damaging or hurting or invalidating. It ends up doing the opposite of the things that we actually intended in the conversation.
yeah, no, that's so true. Well, let's move into just some of the core principles, like the core principles about motivational interviewing, and especially as they might apply to someone who's supporting a loved one with a mood disorder.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say this is that, part of in motivational interviewing, we talk about there being the spirit of motivational interviewing. We talk about the principles that inform what you do when you are in a conversation and you're using motivational interviewing. And then there are the skills, the technical things that you're doing, including asking open-ended questions, right? Offering what we call affirmations, which essentially is a fancy way for saying a fact-based compliments, right? Where you're using what we call this technique called reflective listening and reflective listening and summaries. So from a technical perspective, I'll name the technical perspective, and I also thought a lot about this conversation we were trying to have, and I said, how do I translate this for a non-professional audience about what essentially you're trying to do in a motivational interviewing conversation, right? So the 4 principles for folks who sort of like to nerd out, and I just want to give you the information is, we talk about this piece around express empathy in the conversation, right? And let me actually back up. The spirit of MI is really situated, like how you enter the conversation is one where you're showing up with a spirit of partnership, right? That like, I want to work together with you on this thing, rather than me sort of assuming any role of authority or expertise, right? I might have some information. I might know a little bit more about like sort of what treatments are available because I've done some research. And I'm also going to hold space and respect for the expertise you have as a human being who knows yourself. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to offer respect to that, right? So there's a piece around that's the piece we call partnership, right? And then there's a piece around acceptance, this fundamental stance that I have and I take with you, right? As being accepting of your humanity. So though I might disagree with the way that you behave at times, right? The behaviors that show up inside of you, especially when you're not tending to yourself, when you're not treating your mood disorder, right? While that might be hard for me, the stance I'm going to take with you is one where I am sending signals about my acceptance of you as a human being and seeing your worthiness, therefore, of my compassion and my kindness. Okay, then we have compassion, and then there's a third piece, and this is a piece where we talk about this expressing empathy, and then the last piece is this idea around, this is one of my favorite things about MI, this idea that everything that person needs in terms of their motivation for change already resides in them. And so our goal, rather than trying to what's the word, impose or put it in them, it's actually our job is to actually find it and bring it out, right? So it's this idea of like, come out wherever you are, right? And so part of what we're doing is in the conversation, this is where the principles sort of come into play. From a technical place, right? We talk about 4 principles, express empathy in this conversation, right? And that's what you're going to be doing through using these different skills, right? Support self-efficacy. Everybody is capable. Everybody's capable of making change. So look for signs to support self-efficacy. Then we're going to talk about the third principle that is develop what we call discrepancy. I'm not even going to try to explain that with you right here, right now, but I will talk about from the layperson, how we talk about this. And then the last thing is this idea of rolling with resistance, avoiding argumentation, right? So that's from a technical definition. If we were in an MI training, that's what I would move you through. I thought about the context of our conversation today. I said, what would be most helpful for family members to think about understanding about MI? So the first thing I want you to leave with here is saying, MI essentially is saying, having a loving conversation with somebody where you are essentially exploring the gap between the behaviors they are demonstrating and what they say they want for themselves, what they say matters for them, or who they say they are, right? So that's essentially the heart of what we're trying to do. Now, there are a couple of things that are going to be required in order to be able to do that, right? First of all, it's this thing I said earlier, managing what we call your fixing reflex, right? Our fixing reflex, and all of us have it. All of us have it, right? It's that part of us that wants to make things right. It is the part of us that likes to solve problems. It is the part of us that has difficulty tolerating the pain of our loved one and wanting to save them from distress, wanting to help them. That is where the fixing reflex comes from. And so if you're somebody who knows you really like to help people, number one, your fixing reflex is going to be even bigger, right? And then when it's your family member, it is somebody that you love and care deeply about, and that you are invested, maybe even too invested, right, in the outcome, right? It's going to also be bigger. So I say that to say that it is going to require even more work. So one of the things that I want our listeners to hold here is that while MI was developed for professionals, right? It's been used in many different contexts. So we know that it is also generalized. You can generalize it and use it in basic human relationships, right? But the thing that's important for me to name, why I'm naming that, is that essentially because part of what MI requires is this thing around managing your writing reflex, being able to really recognize that. Let me pause for a second because I want to say it differently. It's that when we cannot separate ourselves from the outcome, it feels impossible then to create space. You see what I'm saying? And so part of when I say, if you walk away with only one thing out of this entire conversation, this idea of slowing down when you are activated and you notice that part of you that wants to jump in and move faster than where your loved one is, finding the way to take care of that part of yourself. Because I promise you, the beautiful thing about the fixing reflex is that it's designed to want to be helpful. The problem with it is two things. One, it is actually about us and not about them. It is actually about soothing us, making us feel helpful, right? Getting us out of the discomfort that we are experiencing. Like if we slow down that fixing reflex, it usually is actually about us. But the second, even more important thing about the fixing reflex and what's problematic about it is that it doesn't consider what we know about the process of change. And so what it ends up doing is that it ends up landing on people in ways that feel invalidating. It ends up shutting down conversation instead of opening it up. So if there's one thing you leave this conversation only with, it's this piece around managing your fixing reflex. The second principle I would say is focus on controlling your controllables. You cannot make a person change. You cannot force your loved one to get treatment. You cannot force them to change. Only they can do that. And that is incredibly hard and scary for us when we are watching the damage mood disorders, untreated mood disorders can have on the lives of our loved ones, right? And so again, if I go back to it, right? So I like the way that quote you gave. So part of the fixing reflex and what our moves happen is we're trying to take control of it, right? But the reality is that what we end up then doing in these conversations because of that part of us is that we end up then losing opportunities in conversations, right? Or doing unhelpful things in conversations. So instead, part of what MI is going to invite you is control your controllables, right? Avoid getting yourself caught in conversations where you're the one arguing for change. Instead, how do you actually position the conversation to be asking your loved one to be the ones? One of the developers of MI, his name is Bill Miller. He says essentially what we're doing in MI conversations is like we're arranging the conversation so that the person hears their own arguments for change, right? So sometimes I give this example when I'm doing trainings of like when people are in ambivalence, they have no choice. That if you take up the side for why in fact they should get treatment, they have no choice but except to explain to you all of the problems and why that's not a good idea for them. And if you actually do an experiment of you actually then making the argument of actually they should not in fact get treatment, they will actually then argue for why they should actually get. So in some ways, right, that's actually what we call this concept of psychological reactions. When people are in ambivalence, there are two sides of them, right? And so if you take up the side of one side, the other side has no choice but to argue for the other side. So in MI, part of the piece that we're doing is we're trying to get ourselves out of power struggles first and foremost, not get caught in power struggles with people, right? Because we at the end of the day, we recognize you are the one who's in control of your life. You are the one who gets to make choice, no matter how badly I want it for you, right? So this does not mean, by the way, giving up on the conversation, not, right, throwing your hands up, right? It's just essentially making a commitment that you're going to walk alongside them in conversation and not impinge on their autonomy. They are the deciders of their life. And your only job, right, is to be creating contexts for them to be able to enter into conversations with you. And when they're in those conversations with you, that you treat it as sacred and you really, really show up with the best versions of yourself, right? To really, really help them feel this level of sense of acceptance while inviting them and being curious with them around, for example, what are the consequences for them about not getting treatment? Where do they think it's going to land? Where's it going to end up? Right? In what ways is it affecting their own dreams for their lives? Having them articulated themselves and you being able to have the opportunity to be able to be giving that back to them, your own understanding of what they're saying. So that really it's almost like they're in a conversation with you, but really they're in a conversation with themselves. You just get to be a mirror and a witness to the conversation. Lisa, is that making sense?
Oh yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
It's landing very deeply. I feel what you're saying. Yes, yes.
Beautiful. So then the third thing I would say is this idea of lovingly helping people explore the gap between the behaviors that they are demonstrating and what they say they want or what matters to them. What we understand, right, about change is that change occurs when human beings themselves notice that there's a discrepancy, right? Because of how we're built as human beings, when we see that there's a discrepancy between what I'm saying, I want, what I believe, and then what I'm doing. Inside of me, I get uncomfortable my own self, right? If I'm saying I have dreams, for example, to open a business, right? I want to, for example, go live elsewhere in the world, right? But I'm having a hard time taking care of my ADLs, right? Because I'm not taking my medication. I'm all over the map with my medication, right? I'm inconsistent about going to my whatever practice I've identified as the way that I'm going to support myself and is going to help me with my mood disorder. If I'm being inconsistent, having somebody hold that to say, tell me from your perspective, how do you imagine that you not being able to hold your appointments as seriously as you would like, and this dream you have for how do they sit together? You see how there's nothing judgmental in my tone about that. I'm showing curiosity. Let me just pause there because I saw you were processing that, taking that in. Tell me what just stood up for you there.
Well, I'm thinking actually about an experience I had this last week. I'm a person with the lived experience of depression and had articulated something I was feeling this last week to somebody else. And it was on a text message, which of course is always its own challenge. But, I said, I'm having a hard time. And the thing that came back to me was about 6 things I should be doing, and my experience of that was that I felt ashamed that I was feeling this way, confused about what I should be doing differently. Oh, I should be grateful. I should be this. I should be that. And, what I wanted to say was, I'm just in my feelings right now, right? I'm just here. And so when I hear you talk about these steps we can take when we're in conversations with people to slow down, to say, I hear you, to reflect back the feelings that are being shared, and then to say, tell me more. Just curiosity alone, tell me more about that. I mean, it makes me want to cry right now, thinking about how that would have been such a different experience for me as somebody who's sharing that I'm having a hard time. So, yeah, these are just, it's not I think so often when we're in these conversations, we think we are supposed, like you said, we're supposed to be fixing, we're supposed to be helping, we're supposed to be giving people a list of things to do, but it's just walking alongside someone in their experience. So, wow.
That's right. For folks who are listening, and you can just take down, Brene Brown has this beautiful video on empathy that if you have an opportunity to watch, I would love to invite everybody. So literally jump on YouTube and search for the words RSA, empathy, Brene Brown. And she does this beautiful as an animation, right? That like your friend would have just been able to say, that sounds hard. Tell me more. That would have gone a long way for you, right? The fact that you're even reaching out to this name is something that's worth celebrating. It could be easy for you to actually keep that inside of you, right? And just be navigating that internally, right? So this is what I was saying earlier around these moves that we're socialized to do because we want to be helpful. Because if I talk to your friend, my guess is that they got nervous.
Totally.
They got nervous.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's almost like, I don't, so this is when you actually ask people when they're making these moves in conversation, nobody ever starts and says, you know what, I want to be invalidated. You know what, I'm going to be invalidating to my family, to my loved one. Nobody starts there. It always starts from this place of like, I want to actually be helpful, but I don't know what to say. So I think to myself, if I say, here are the 6 things you should do, that's going to actually be empowering, right? But in reality, it actually feels dismissive. It feels simplifying. It doesn't create space and room for you. And so remember that thing I said earlier about the stages of change, right? That there's 6 stages of, for folks who may be familiar, there's 6, what the research has shown and demonstrated is like for folks studying change, right, is that there's 6 stages that sort of change process occurs through. First is the pre-contemplation, where people are not even aware of the problem. They don't even have recognized the problem. You might see the problem, but they're not even aware of the problem. Contemplation is that there's some recognition of the problem, but there's a but. Whenever you hear people say buts alongside, you know that they're in contemplation, right? So there's a recognition of the problem, but they're not yet quite ready they're in ambivalence about what they want to do about the problem, right? Then the next stage of change is what we call preparation, right? In this stage, people are then preparing. They've reduced the ambivalence enough, and they're now looking for information about what to do about it. Then there is action, right? This is when people are then taking steps. They're experimenting with what they're doing about it, right? Then there's maintenance. It is now part of their lifestyle, right? This change is sort of part and parcel of like how they're moving in the world. And then there's relapse. And relapse is, one of the things that sort of feels really important that these researchers helped us understand as a society, or as a field certainly, is how much relapse is actually an opportunity for people to collect information about what wasn't working about their change plan, right? And it's an important part of the change process. And so part of what you're describing, and this is one of the things that you said, is like a lot of times when we enter the conversation, a lot of times people prematurely jump to action. They assume that when we're the place that you enter the conversation, where a person enters, your loved one enters the conversation, we assume that they are in action when they actually might be in contemplation. They might just be like recognizing. They might actually just want space to just be able to. So again, it depends. So we're so used to listening to, how do we say this? It's around like listening to respond versus listening to understand, right? So this is why I'm saying, I go back to this piece around this second principle: control your controllables, right? And then lovingly explore the gap, right? MI is about exploring the gap between what is happening and what a person desires, right? And then the next thing I would say about an MI conversation is invest your energy in understanding their perspective and showing them that understanding. And what that means, that it requires you to actively listen. And it is hard for us as human beings to listen. It is really, really, let me make fun of myself really quickly. When I learned MI, I learned MI after I was already given my doctoral degree. I was already a psychologist. And then I took motivational interviewing. And the training, the first activity, which I do in my trainings, is this activity where you invite people to have a conversation, and you have to hold silence, and all you're doing is listening. And it was the first time I realized that when people were talking to me, the moment that they had said something that engaged me, I then was spending the time crafting my response, what I'm going to say back, and sometimes how smart I'm going to sound, right? Rather than actually listening to what they were saying. And so one of the things that sometimes we minimize and oversimplify is actually how difficult listening is and how much attention it requires, right? But if you say you want to do MI is actually going to slow you down and invite you to actually listen. What is this person saying to you? Right? To really listen and look at the world through their eyes, hear through their ears, right? And our ability to tolerate, be willing to see, even if it is scary for you or you disagree, stay in it with them, right? And then part of what MI is going to invite you, and this is one of the, if there's only one skill you get to learn about MI, and you get to ever have an opportunity to learn this skill, it's this skill called reflective listening. And all you're essentially doing is actually giving the person back your understanding of what you heard them say, so that they get a chance to hear themselves and reflect, is that what I actually meant to convey? And in that process, it actually deepens their own knowledge of, it helps them deepen what they're actually trying to say, right? or it helps them clarify what they're actually trying to say, right? But this third principle, this fourth principle rather, is about this piece around like committing that when we're in conversation, prioritizing listening to understand versus listening to respond. Okay? And so part of the thing that we're then doing while we're doing that is that we're essentially trying to prioritize mirroring back to them, reflecting back to them the arguments that they are making for change. Right? And a lot of times when we're in conversation, another thing that we do unintentionally just because of the way we're socialized is that we're usually reacting to people's arguments for keeping things the same. Right? That activates us and then we want to start to do a bunch of things around it. And Maya is going to actually teach you to prioritize listening for their arguments for actually making change and picking those up, helping them elaborate on that, you showing curiosity about that, all of those. So this is kind of the skill that sort of is required, right? But even if you don't have any training and you're walking away from this conversation and you say to yourself, the only one thing I want to start to do moving forward is just mirroring back to people what you are understanding that they are communicating. And then the last thing I'll say about another principle in MI is this willingness to build people up with fact-based compliments. Walk through the eyes looking for the good. And don't only just notice it inside of your mind, get explicit about it. Right? Part of when dealing with mood disorders, it takes a toll on our self-esteem. It helps us, we stop being able to have a positive and good view of ourselves. Emma is going to invite you to say, walk around, walk with your loved one with a commitment to wearing glasses where you are seeing the best in them. But if you notice, I didn't say to BS them. I said, give them fact-based compliments. When you see progress, little tiny progress, you want to be explicit about you're seeing them, right? When you're seeing strengths in them. So for example, the friend you mentioned, Lisa, that your friend could just say, your willingness to even just get on the phone to text that to me, right? It says a lot, right, about your own longing for support. Thank you. Like even that would have been something, right? So part of the thing we say in MI is that we want to fuel people up, give people energy with facts-based because essentially what we know is that when we're seeing people start to borrow, when they can't see themselves, they start to borrow our own lens to look at themselves through. Let me stop there. How's everything I'm saying landing? What's making sense?
Wow. I keep thinking about power dynamics. I think that's something that you referred to, and especially from a caregiver side of things, perhaps the power dynamics of being a parent or being a spouse, that those come into play. And I just this notion of the reflecting back and the curiosity sound like they automatically slow everything down and give space so that you can, like you said, have this ability to say, what's getting activated in me right now? Can I be aware of these types of dynamics? And can I give myself the grace of knowing that I'm doing my best in this moment and I do want to help and I do love this person? But just that technique really opens up to be able to look at all of those different dynamics that are at play. Because look, this is all theoretical and great, but then when you're in it, it's really hard. And I think that first step of being like, let me take a breath.
That's
Let
right.
me reflect back what I'm hearing.
That's
Wow,
right.
that just goes a really long way.
That's right. Part of the thing I think is beautiful about this model is that it really, if you say you want to do this model, it actually inherently teaches you to slow down. Everything starts to slow down, right? And it's when things are slowed down that we start to see opportunity. When things are slowed down, right, is the pieces where we are able to see what is mine versus what is yours, right? When things are slowed down is this place where then it allows us really for me to walk next to you rather than walking ahead of you, right? When things are slowed down, you can feel my respect for your perspective in this conversation that's about you and your life, not me or my life, you and your life.
Yeah, that there's, to borrow another phrase, that the dignity of our own experience, that we all deserve the dignity of walking our own path and figuring it out. And, that's what I love so much about what you're sharing today. It's really centering that. So, let's move on to our other questions so we don't run out of time. Because there is a question in here from Susan saying, this is really hard because depression so often affects a person's thinking, analytical skills, and ability to make decisions. So that kind of goes into our next question, which is some of the common mistakes caregivers can make when trying to help their loved ones and how these techniques can avoid some of those pitfalls.
Yep. It is absolutely really, really hard, right? It is absolutely really, really hard, right? And so again, this is the piece where I think this model again is sort of inviting and saying, can we slow down, right? And our willingness and our ability to slow down in those conversations, right? And so that's the piece, right? And one of the things I love about MI, right, is like, MI is not going to tell you not to give your perspective, but it's going to ask you to ask for permission before you offer your perspective if your loved one has not solicited it. So let's say, for example, your loved one is in fact sharing, offering distorted thinking, right, with what they are saying. Then you ask permission to say, is it okay for me to share my perspective? And they say yes. And you say, babe, honey, I see it differently. Here's what I see and here's what I think. How does that land for you? Which part of what I said makes sense to you? You see how it sort of becomes this like that word a collaborative conversation, right? Versus because I'm the one who doesn't have depression, I have perfectly clear thinking, and therefore my thinking is the right. You almost right again. It takes this empowering piece, though in fact you're right. Depression absolutely compromises, right? The thinking of a person, their abilities to sort of see into the future, it compromises a lot. And how we are in the conversation with the person, that we keep maintaining, right? Honoring their dignity, showing respect for their perspective is also important. But thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, and I think another tool that you mentioned that I think could be helpful here, has been helpful to me as a caregiver in the past, is that the glasses on, and seeing through their eyes. And I think sometimes if someone's experiencing an untreated mood disorder and there is a lot of distorted thinking, um, that calling out of the parts of them that are grounded and loving and capable can really bring people back to earth, essentially, in a way. So I love that technique. I think that's an important, really important tool to help people who might be um, agitated or distorted thinking.
Absolutely.
Are there any other, let's see, any other common mistakes you can think of? I mean, some of them are
Yeah.
intuitive, I guess, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the way that the three mistakes I think are the most common is the thing we talked about earlier, that piece around people prematurely engaging in planning, right? Part of what MI is going to do is matching your response to where a person is in terms of the change process. And people let you know where they are by the things that they're saying. So if, for example, your partner or your loved one is there's a way they dismiss, they're continuously dismissive, that they even have a mood issue. It's not diagnosed. They think you're like, it's just their personality, right? They're just right. That tells you that they're in pre-contemplation, right? And so the thing that we should be doing then is not about sort of having conversations about the treatment they should be getting, because we're not in the same conversation, right? So from an MI perspective, what we want to be doing is helping to start to see where there might be ambivalence actually for them, right? So on one hand, they see it as a personality issue, or really your issue, right? But is there any ways in which actually it's harming them? It's not working for them, that they're not, what are they not loving about it? You see how when they start to then talk about the things that's not working, you start to they start to sort of feel there's a little ambivalence that's starting to come forward. When somebody is actually in ambivalence, again, us jumping ahead isn't helpful, right? So when people are in contemplation where they're saying, I know there's a problem, but, right? They're saying to you essentially that they, on one hand, there's a part of them that wants to keep things the same, and one part of them that wants to grow, but they're holding both. What they're asking for is support to reduce the ambivalence. Because if that ambivalence is not reduced, it's what gets in the way of their feet, right? And sometimes people, their language is saying, I'm going to do, but then they don't actually take the action that correlates with it. That's another example that they're actually in contemplation. But the point is about matching our response, right, to where then they are in the conversation, so that our focus, right, is around reducing. And this is what MI was specifically designed for. When people are actually in a place where they are ready for information, they want support, or they're looking for advice, then go ahead and give that to them because they're in preparation. But this piece around, so this number one mistake is that piece around the mismatch between where people are and how we respond. Another mistake that people do is that we confuse what is ours versus what is our loved ones, right? So we think, a lot of times we think that we're showing care, but what we're often doing unintentionally or inadvertently is we're impinging on the autonomy. The person feels like you are impinging on their autonomy. They feel like they're being directed, they're being told what to do, right? Or they're feeling judged, right? And again, a lot of times what's usually responsible for that is that our fixing reflex has taken over, right? So part of what MI is this piece around like my ability to see what is mine. I'm getting scared. And so when I'm getting scared, what do I do to say to myself to calm myself, right? Rather than operating in a way that's essentially imposing that on the other, right? So part of this thing is confusing what belongs to us versus what belongs to our loved ones. And this piece I said earlier, we cannot force change. Only they are in control of whether or not they are going to get support, what that support is going to look like. Only they can choose that. So our only responsibility in some ways is really around creating the best environment for conversation with them, that we help them think through their choices. You with me? And then the third thing I think sometimes is that sometimes we get scared that if we show too much love, it might be enabling, right? And we get confused about what the line is between enabling and what supporting is, right? And so the way that I certainly think about this is that enabling is when we are not, again, when there's not that clear line between me and you, right? So for example, what might be a good example that I can, that sometimes, for example, I'll tell you sometimes, for example, maybe you see again, I'll use the treatment example. I've had this happen as a therapist where people will call on behalf of their loved one for the appointment, and then their loved one doesn't show up for the appointment, right? And so this is an example of what does it look like for you to say, I will make this phone call with you. I will sit with you. Here's the phone number. Let's sit together. But it's you making the call. Right? Because even that process allows the person to start to own. Right? And so again, that's not to judge. So let's say the person, you do that for the person and then they don't make the appointment. They don't, right? But then almost like us, when we get caught in the recurring, right? But I think there's a line between what is mine versus what is yours. And my job is to do my best to equip and support you without then doing it or taking over for you. And then the last thing I would say is that when we, again, remember I said to you on this piece, I want to say, because I feel like, part of the piece I want to be really, really explicit with you all is that I'm so clear that what I'm asking is incredibly difficult, right? And the piece that almost feels like a setup in some ways, right? Even the developers of MI are clear, right? That it is incredibly hard. It is incredibly hard to use MI with a loved one because sometimes you're intertwined in it, right? It is hard when the consequence is not going to only fall on them. It's going to fall on you and maybe people that you also love. So it is so hard when I'm over here talking about manager writing reflex. So you're like, are you crazy? Are you crazy? If this person doesn't get treatment, if they don't change their behavior, my children are suffering at my partner's hands. What do you mean manager writing reflex, Dr. Buki? You're crazy. right? And so that's a piece I'm like holding and saying, absolutely, right? What I'm asking is incredibly, incredibly challenging. And yet, what we know is that to not do so, we end up doing unhelpful things in conversation and missing our opportunity to support people, to help them find their own motivation for change. Let me pause there.
Yes, I can relate to all of that. Certainly, unlike the previous anecdote I told, as a caregiver, I've definitely been in fixing mode a lot, and and I think it took me understanding that them being okay did not mean I was okay, and them not being okay didn't mean I wasn't okay. And for so long, I was worried about how it looked and what was happening, and that that
Yeah,
so much work I had to do on myself to unmesh, to
that's
get
right.
out of codependency, to take care of myself, to understand my power
That's
dynamics, which is work you can do in between, right?
right.
You're not in that moment going to be going necessarily, but it's work you can just always slowly be doing on yourself.
Yeah.
Is the greatest gift I ever gave those people that
Mhm.
I've cared for,
Yep.
um,
Yep. Yep.
and
Yep.
still working on it.
Absolutely. And even I,
It's
right? All
progress,
of
not
us.
perfection.
That's
Yeah,
right. All of
totally.
us. I teach MI for a living, and I cannot tell you how many times my writing reflex takes over. So by
Yeah.
no way is like, again, that's a piece I want to be clear that I'm not in any
Yeah.
way understating is how difficult, but not impossible.
Yes. And that's the grace we have to give ourselves, right? We're always doing the best that we can at the time.
Yep.
Um, okay, we're running out of time, but I want to look at, okay, so we had some practical examples we maybe wanted to go through, and then talking a little bit about how caregivers can maintain our own emotional well-being while using these techniques. We've talked a little bit about that, but
Yeah.
are there any practical examples you can
I think
share?
the piece I would just say is just like, one of the things that was important about distinguishing is, if folks I'll have the opportunity to go learn motivational interviewing, I promise you, it will be transformational for your life. It will be transformational for your life. And one of the things that I talk about is this idea of like, there are motivational interviewing conversations, and then there's like just operating with a motivational interviewing informed approach, right? And so goes back to that spirit I was saying earlier around this piece around the willingness for us to show empathy to people and express that explicitly to people when they are expressing signals of distress, for us to take the beat, right? This piece around really avoiding being in arguments with people and power struggles with people about change, about their own, right? So really avoiding doing that, and making moves that we know evoke reactivity, right? And my really is this piece around like really protecting the relationship without necessarily give. Sometimes we think it's like, I can either I can only do the love part but not the goal part, or I can do the goal part and not the love part, right? But in mind would sort of take the position that we can do both, right? That we can really show up with a lot of compassion and still have guided conversations with people where we're really supporting them to really be thinking through what's most helpful for them, right? And so it's not a kumbaya. On one hand, you can learn this model and think it's a kumbaya model, but if you notice the question I was asking earlier, right? How do you how do you imagine things will continue, will occur for you in your life if you don't in fact engage that referral you've been talking about for quite a bit, right? What negative consequences do you worry about occurring? Rather than me taking time to tell you about all the negative consequences of your behavior, why don't I show curiosity about what you think about that, right? What are the things that you think would be helpful for you, right? What do you see as the smallest next step you're willing to take, right? What was your life like, right? Before it felt like this mood disorder took over your life, right? What feels like the thing that that you have to, you see how I'm asking all those questions rather than me being the one who's just telling you. And my says, look for it. It's already inside of people. We just don't show that curiosity to help it surface. Right. So I think that piece around just this importance about making a distinction between when I'm gonna have an MI conversation is saying, hey, Lisa, is it okay for us to have a conversation to talk a little bit about your depression, right? And what's happening with it, So like I'm entering a conversation, and then in that conversation, right, I'm going to be listening for specific things, right? And knowing what to leverage in that conversation, right? Again, related to your own arguments, your own desire, your own need for change versus mine.
Yes. Wow, just blown away. These are just incredible
Mm.
techniques. We have a question here that is kind of in line with what we're talking about. How can we assist our family members who are extremely resistant to listening? So, it's interesting, as you said, Lisa, can I just talk to you about your depression? I have the right to say yes or no there,
Right.
and that has to be respected.
That's right.
But maybe if you're dealing with somebody who's up against the line of self-harm or some really potentially challenging issues, who's resistant to
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what MI was designed for, right? Is this, let me first this piece that what we talk about in MI, this idea of resistance, right? A lot of times when people when you look at the research of what people call resistance, what we discovered is that resistance is the reactivity that occurs in the relationship when people are describing that they want to maintain status quo, right? And all of the tension that shows up with us with them because they are saying they want to maintain status quo, right? Or when they're signaling to us that there's discord in the relationship, that there's something we're doing that's creating that's not landing well for them. So if you help me put up that question, like, what do we do with when somebody is actually showing I think the question said, can you read that question to me again? Resistant to listening?
Yes, resistant to listening.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I
Yeah.
I think the first thing is slowing down, right? What is it that right? Even that piece of to be able to say something's happened in our relationship where I see your guards are up. Might you help me understand what's happened so that then they have a chance to help you tell you what they're experiencing, right? Or it's if you are aware of what you might have done to then do a repair. I seem to have stepped on your toes somehow in this conversation. I'm really, really sorry about that. Can we rewind? Can I ask that question in a different way? So I think the reason why I'm saying that is this idea of resistance. Sometimes we assume resistance is a personality trait. It's something that's wrong with the person. Whereas in MI, our framework and our belief is that resistance is a product of interpersonal, is happening in the context of interpersonal communication.
So it's like information, right? Resistance isn't necessarily something we should. It's information about how the dynamics unfolding, and that we have a chance there to be curious about it.
1,000%. It's
Yeah.
almost something I say is it is better for you to have somebody who's showing you that they are reacting, so that
Mm,
you have the opportunity to fix it versus the person who just yeses you, but
mm.
inside, right? They're actually right. So resistance is this piece around like it's when you see resistance, it means slow down and tend to the relationship.
Yeah, that's great, great, great advice. Let me sure there's no more questions here. We could talk forever. Um, the last question you and I were just going to talk about was emotional well-being for caregivers, and I just want to plug FFDA's website because there's so many webinars and resources there. That's how I first found out about the organization, looking for it for myself. But is there anything, briefly you'd like to share in regards to that?
Yeah, I think because of how caregivers are like, how caregivers are oriented, right? This assumption we make of like just kind of putting ourselves on a back burner, right? So I think if there's anything I want to say here that you take away from me about this is you cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You got to take care of yourself. So where's the opportunity? Who's your community? Who are you leaning into to pour into you, given you're tending to others, right? What are the things that you do that are nourishing to you? How are you operating in your life in a way, right, that is honoring of you, right? So this piece is you cannot pour from an empty cup, right? So being clear about what your own sources of support are, because if you don't have one, I promise you, you will absolutely burn out.
And I would just add to that that, there's nothing right or wrong about what we're talking about or what you're doing. Again, we're all doing the best we can, giving us that grace and to be curious. I think curiosity is the best antidote to fear, to isolation, to these things that we've been talking about today that are challenges. Let's just make sure. Oh, and just that the unknown is scary, right? And that's sometimes what we're asking people to dance with here. So thank you so much for participating. Dr. Buki, how can we stay connected to what you're doing and learn more about motivational interviewing?
Yeah, so if you are on Blue Sky, find me on Blue Sky. The Blue Sky typical thing, Dr. Buki, search for that. Um, I'm going to be doing a training a motivational interviewing training for the public sometime in April, top of May. So if you are interested in that, please shoot an email to hello@myrelationship.hq.com to be added to our newsletter, so that we let you know once we put a date for that. Secondly, I'm also doing a program called Masculine Centered, which is really designed for men and masculine oriented people. It's about a 10 and a half hour program that occurs over a period of 7 weeks. And it's really, really designed to be like a gym for men and masculine oriented people, really building your mental and relational muscles. The thing that's really, really cool about it and why it's connected to this is that a lot of the skills that I'm teaching in that is very much influenced or connected to MI. So if in fact, like, it is something that you're interested in, and you identify as a man, and we're going to have different cohorts, but this first cohort we're doing is going to be for men in heterosexual relationships who are in marital or long-term relationships. Then I'm going to run a cohort next for gay men, and then one for trans men and masculine centered people.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I believe all those resources have been put in the chat here and will be available on FFDA's website where this video will reside. Dr. Buki, I'm so grateful. I know the organization is so grateful and the people who are listening today. And don't forget to fill out the survey if you can, if you've been watching, so that we can improve our future programming. We hope this information empowers you and your loved ones and your family. And we're grateful that you were able to join us. Take
Thank you.
care.